Hi, I'm Pamela Jaccarino, Editor-in-Chief of Luxe Interiors and Design. Welcome to Creative Conversations on Design TV. Today, I'm speaking with artist Sally King Benedict, whose visual voice is incredibly strong, inspiring, and beautiful. Hi, Sally, welcome. It's great to have you on Design TV.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I've been looking.
Yeah, I know we publish your house, and it's always so fun to, first of all, get an artist on who I have told you already, I am a super fan. And I feel like most of our viewers know you, but if you don't, Sally has many super fans. I am one of them. And then also someone's home, because you get sort of this personal view into who they are. So I know we're going to talk a little bit about that project in a bit. But I wanted to kick things off and ask about your artwork. You are an abstract expressionist painter with a very intuitive, improvised approach, i.e. you're not walking in the studio with like a plan necessarily,
Right.
although maybe you do have one somewhere in your
I
mind.
try to have something, but it never works out. So I kind of just walk in.
What is it like? I mean, your paintings are so beautiful and filled with emotion. So talk a little bit about what attracted you to that style that you have now, and what is it like to walk in and just go for it?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I don't know how to do it any other way, to be honest. I think since I've been a child, I've always um felt like I was expressing myself through my art. And I was such a visual person when I was little that, the emotions are, that's what starts me to do anything really. So, when I get into the studio, I feel like whenever, I kind of, the way I'm feeling that day is really, dictates the palette. And then I sort of start there with color. And then it just evolves. I mean, the pieces don't have, like I said, like a set plan. I don't typically paint from a sketchbook or anything like that. They just really turn into something on their own through the process. And it just becomes a story, for me. And then what happens at the end can be very different than what happened at the beginning, because it just reflects the way you feel really, and the way I want the viewer to feel when they see it.
That's super interesting. And also it just occurred to me, like, what if you started on a Monday and then you go back in on a Tuesday, and like you have a different head.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the biggest part of being, an intuitive painter, is that it has to change with the days, it has to change with the time and everything. And then the way it ends is it helps you to remember all of those timestamps and all of those feelings.
Yeah, because your work is, I mean, one of the many things that makes your work so intriguing and interesting is that there's so many layers there. If you get up close and you really see,
Right.
there is sort of this story that evolves
Right.
through the artwork, which is what makes it, so magical.
Mhm.
Um, Also, your work, Sally, has such a confident, I just look at everything that you do and it feels so joyful. There's an exuberance to it and sort of a bit of a sense of like pushing boundaries a bit.
Yeah.
What is it like for you to, it's kind of scary to stand down a blank canvas, but how do you sort of get into the zone, even though it's just sort of like, I'm going in, it's a Wednesday, this is how I'm feeling.
Right.
Give us a glimpse into like, what's it like in your studio, in your head, and what you have to get prepped, wise.
Right. You walk into my studio and there is paintings everywhere. There's tons of painting on the floor, I really can't start with just one. And I think the way to get out of my head really is to work on a number of things at the same time. And, typically I start by warming up by maybe putting down some color, or just, kind of the way I'm feeling that day, sort of the energy of the color can lead it, or just different mark making. just like doing anything, I feel like it's really good to get a little bit like your heart rate up, just a little bit physical. And, I do a lot of yoga, so I try to really, calm down in my head too. But, it definitely helps when I have a few things going on at the same time, because whatever works on one piece, might not work on the other. And then I find out that this color harmony and combination works here. And so I bounce around the studio. I sort of, I think somebody would look in and think of it as a little bit chaotic, like this, how in the world does she keep anything straight? But just, that's just the way I work. It's just, it keeps things interesting for me. And I don't like to get so hyper focused on one thing. And the minute you start to, in my opinion, and from what I took from college too, from my professor, you pick your favorite thing and then you do everything to not touch it. And so it's almost better to just, let it go and work on a number of things.
Well, there's also, I think, a liveliness to all of your work. And so, what you just described, it's so interesting how that energy makes its way onto the paper or onto the canvas. That's one of the things that's just, so wonderful and interesting about art and talking to artists about the process.
Yeah.
We have to talk about color. I'm a big color girl. I know you are as well. And you have such a keen sense of color and how to mix those combinations. Will you talk a little bit about what your approach is, and also just like your love for color?
Oh my gosh, I do. I know. I feel like each individual color just has its own incredible story and potential, and and it's, to me, I've said it already, but the color kind of dictates this mood you sort of walk into, or when you walk into a room or a beautiful interior, whatever that color and palette is, it sort of envelops you and makes you feel a certain way. So I just, experimentation is one of my favorite things about color, and just the way they talk to each other. And even the lack of color is super fascinating to me. I mean, the science behind color is, just as interesting as, the art part, the color theory, and the way they harmonize, and the way I love the relationships of color. I think it's just always very fun, and it's always kind of problem solving on the canvas or on the paper of what works together, what speaks together, and then what doesn't. And contrast really, is always in my mind. And I'm so attracted to contrast in anything else, in anybody else's work, whatever it is, honestly. And so I really love to have that moment that these colors can, form, whatever conversation they're having on the canvas. It's great.
Yeah, that's interesting. The colors are talking to each other. What mediums are there certain mediums that you're using, that you're attracted to, and are you mixing your colors? Talk a little bit about that detail.
Yeah, I use, because of the different, dimensions of the painting, I use a lot of water-based, like inks and acrylics and fluid acrylics and gouache to sort of lay down first, because it's more of like an immediate satisfaction for me. And then I work more into like, water mixable oils have been an incredible invention, and I think a lot of artists still haven't even found out about these, but it makes it a lot more approachable to use oils when you don't have to use all of the, all of the other stuff. So I do that. And then I end up, using a lot of charcoal and drawing techniques mixed in with the paintings. And then I use a lot of really heavy bodied pigment sticks that are just basically oil sticks to give it that last bit of texture. And a lot of times just kind of a drawn effect of whatever, I use everything I can get my hands on.
It's an interesting mix.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about, the faces that you do. You do a lot of different things, but you sort of these abstracted tennis sets and outdoor scenes and landscapes. But I feel like your abstracted artwork of faces are now iconic and very coveted by collectors. How did they come about, and sort of what's the inspiration behind them?
I do. I love this question. And I always find out something new, even about the way they come out every time I answer it. But it did start, I would say, in college when you do a lot of self-portraiture work and, you have a lot of assignments with drawing from life or, all of those things. And I think my studio mates, just everybody's different approach to a portrait and the way they saw themselves. I think really inspired me. Just, it just didn't have to be so literal and so representational. And so I took that, and then I started to, kind of lose the mirror. I sort of started to get tired of doing the same thing, which was me. And then I really, thought more about the woman that raised us and how she made us feel so warm and so safe in our house. And when she passed away, I wanted a piece of her with me forever. And I wanted it in our home. And that she really inspired the first piece that was, not me as much, but, somebody else that I loved. And then, all the qualities in her that I loved. And it really, once I got out of college and I, really started doing it for a career, I found that people really resonated with, the figure in the face. And sometimes they could see themselves or see somebody else they knew. And, I think it kind of speaks to everybody in a way. And I like that. And I wanted people to have, almost like a home protector, just the way I did. And so it really is all about all the people I meet and everybody I want to meet, the places I want to go, the places I've been. It could be anybody, really. I want it to be whoever anybody wants it to be, really.
Yeah, I mean, I love those faces, and they just have a joy, and yeah, it's almost like someone in your house that's watching out for you and
Yes.
protecting you, as you said, which is really sort of a lovely sentiment to have that. While studying at the College of Charleston, you worked for an interior designer. Her name is Kathleen Rivers. How do you talk a little bit about your approach to interiors? We're going to specifically talk about, your home in Atlanta, because I've got some questions for you about that, which we published. But, how do you think about interiors and art, and how did that experience of working with Kathleen sort of inform, your own artwork and your thinking about artwork?
She is a brilliant designer, and she's so loved and so well respected. And it was really great to work with a designer that loved art, had an appreciation for art, loved interiors just as much, but the natural way that her clients, collected art, or if they needed her assistance, it just didn't seem so forced. It seemed very natural for her, the way she created a space maybe around a piece of art, or, the way she placed. I just always thought that she had a very natural approach, and it wasn't so formulated, and it just looked just looked very beautiful and elegant, and it never looked decorated. I don't know if that makes sense, but she had me working projects like gold leafing chairs and, anything I could do to use my hands instead of, pulling fabrics, which I love to do too. She'd have like a challenge, and I'll do the mirrors, or I'll paint whatever. And then she ended up actually using my paintings that I was still completing my last year of college, and her clients sort of started to take a notice. And she and another one of my favorite women, who's a jewelry designer, Janet Gregg, hosted my first art show. And so I think with people like that, push you and noticed something in you, it was, I mean, I'm so forever grateful for them because they saw that I really needed to take that direction and just stick with that.
Yeah. And I mean, to have, design, I mean, it's so important to have sort of the art and the interiors feel effortless,
Yeah.
right? We've seen where it just feels like this doesn't really work. I imagine you work with a lot of interior designers. I mean, you have a lot of just collectors, but I imagine that there's a lot of interior designers that buy from you and also have you do commissions for their interiors.
Yeah, that's right. And I really love both sides of it, to be honest. The commissions are really fun. And I think a lot of people are surprised when I say that, but as long as I can also do what I need to do and make time for experimentation and, trying to get somewhere, but the designers keep me on my toes and it's so much fun to work with them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, particularly with you being sort of this intuitive artist that's just like, I'm going to go in and do what I need to do. But then you also have an interior design client who might really want you to follow maybe something that they're expecting at the end.
Right. Yeah. And most times I think people see a past work that, is no longer available, or maybe from a series, that I'm not currently doing, or and the interior designers that I work for are they trust me and I trust them, and we don't really ever have an issue. They're just, here's the space, the client loves these pieces that you've done, and here you go. And then I don't really communicate and send updated pictures and all that, because like I said, the painting can change so much. So I really just share those images at the end. And then, if we need to make little adjustments here and there, I really enjoy that part, because I enjoy making the client just so happy, and just to, a lot of people don't really know what they want and they can't really express what they see as the end result. And that's where the designer is a great resource for me, because it kind of takes that anxiety away for everybody. And they're just like, they're communicating with both of us. And it's really nice sometimes, because they are able to explain to the client, she knows what she's doing, trust her, and then it's sort of seamless. It's really fun.
Yeah, that's great. So we featured your beautiful Atlanta home in our May, June issue, and you oversaw the renovation and interiors yourself. And your home sort of has this global traveler on dream vacation vibe. Tell us a little bit about what that was like for you. And stylistically, what were you going for? And how much did you enjoy doing those interiors?
Yes, I'm lucky. My husband is just as passionate as I am. And we've always, really bonded over that. It feels like our baby, our house is, our space. We're both so, we really like to make a comfortable, approachable, storied space. And we both grew up kind of around, beautiful homes. Our grandparents had incredible style, and they always just were very elegant, but very casual. And that's sort of how we wanted to live. And if we couldn't get out of the city, if we couldn't get to the mountains or to the beach, we figured it was just best to bring them to us. And so, but it just naturally progresses over time, and we take our time. We move furniture around a ton. There are things that we just can't live without that have been in houses and rentals from Charleston from when we were 20, and, things that we both have bought from estate sales. We just kind of enjoy the process so much that at the end, it got to a point where we just felt like we were on vacation, and so it was fabulous. We loved it.
Yeah, I think the indoor outdoor connection. Just like the whole pool area and the way you do the landscaping was really beautiful and well done. We were so happy to share it with our readers.
Yeah. And I think when you're so well, for us, we were both so involved. I mean, my husband basically was the general contractor, and, it just makes it that much sweeter. Sometimes it's like, it's so much work, but it's just like, oh man, there's a lot of mistakes. So we'll learn, you always learn from your mistakes, but it makes it really nice.
Yeah, and you have an appreciation for builders and contractors and designers and architects and everything that they bring to the equation.
Right.
You have such a distinctive voice with your art, and collectors sort of love your style. How do you evolve in terms of your range, right? It's like people like they're like, I want the Sally King Benedict, I want those faces.
Yeah.
And you have super fans. I am one of them. So how is that tricky in terms of like, for yourself and as an artist, sort of exploring other areas that you want to, um, tackle? Talk a little bit about, your approach to that.
It is, it's sometimes hard to break out of a routine that feels so, it just kind of comes so naturally. Like the face, I do feel like the figurative faces are, they're such a part of me. It does feel like they typically flow out a little bit easier than, say, uh, you know, like a purely abstracted, attempt at a color field painting or something. But as long as I give myself permission and time to experiment, yeah, I mean, I honestly do. It's the one thing I try to plan is a day, 2 days to just not worry about everything else in the studio and just do something kind of funky and crazy and make a sculpture or, it could be anything. It could be read a book. I mean, it's, look into people that I would love to collaborate with, these like dream people that I would like to approach or something. And I'd like to be able to be in the education part of it more, but with a young family, that's been difficult. So I think, just to always have plans on the horizon to better yourself, to learn more, helps to sort of break that monotony. But I also think there is really great value in repetition. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, don't overflow the market with, that kind of thing. But nothing is the same. Everything's different. And so to me, it's okay. I think, I give myself grace that it's okay if I do 50 faces that day, even if they're tiny, because that's the way I learned one thing about, out of those 50 that might be valuable for my next painting. I just,
And the artist should, go where the artist wants to go, right? There's like the market, and we get that, but I feel like,
yeah.
Let the artist be.
Right. And then the selling versus making is that battle, right? Of a career artist or career creative or anything. It's the juggle between the business and the actual creating. So
And yeah, my last question for you, Sally, because we have a lot of designers and creative people who are watching, and I think, it's always interesting for me to hear from creative people, like, how do you fill that creative well, right? You have got a thriving studio practice with lots of collectors, and what do you do so that you are feeling inspired?
I love to be at home and to be quiet and, no TVs on. And if I need a day off from the studio, even if I have a deadline, it's okay. I just won't work that day because, rest and peace and all of those things and yoga and, of course, traveling and just sort of unplugging the visual stimulation that we all have every single day, and just to be out in nature, swimming or anything that, I listen to a ton of music. I love to drive around in the car, and there's so many things to clear my head and to kind of fill that bucket. But I typically mostly just sort of leave my phone in another room. I never sleep with it in the same room. And I just try to snuggle with my kids and take in what's around me, because that's ultimately what I bring back into the studio. I mean, everything, makes the paintings what they are. So if I'm not paying attention to what's actually around me, I hit a drought.
Right. Yeah. It all sort of visually comes in and then is digested and then comes out onto the canvas.
Yeah.
Well, it has been such a pleasure to speak with you. And we just love what you do. And again, thanks for letting us publish your beautiful home.
Oh, thank you. It was so much fun to work with y'all. And I adore you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome to our panelists today as we talk about how we can make all buildings healthier. And when we say all buildings, I just want to explain for a second there. As Bill explained, getting to non-toxic, healthy materials is a challenge across our sector. It is an especial challenge when we look at existing buildings and adaptive reuse, which is going to be an upcoming concern, of course, for our industry. It is also more challenging in certain parts of our industry, especially healthcare sector, hospitality sector. Certain building types have a tougher time in terms of, being able to negotiate regulations, sustainability considerations, as well as health and toxicity considerations. So there still remain a lot of challenges ahead of us in terms of creating truly healthy buildings. And when we say healthy, we mean not just physical well-being, but mental and social well-being as well. To help us sort of unpack some of the challenges we currently face, some of the strides that we have made in the field, I'm so glad to have with us Avide Hagigi, who is the Associate Principal at CGF. Avide, thank you so much for joining us. We have Eileen Gore, who's the Senior Sustainable Analyst for HDR. Eileen, thank you so much for taking the time out today. Rachel Birkin, who's a Sustainability Program Manager, with MECO. Rachel, such a pleasure. And Susan Rhodes, who's the Vice President of Marketing at Armstrong Ceilings. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm gonna start with Avide here. Avide, you've been a passionate advocate for healthy materials and for regenerative design. How do you understand the connection between sustainability and healthy materials? And how can designers start to address health at that building scale and look at regenerative strategies when it comes to health?
That's a great question. So really the concept of regenerative design is all about restoring, rejuvenating, and renewing the systems within which a building exists. It's really a systems thinking approach to design that essentially eliminates this concept of waste. That is an issue that we deal with consistently in the building industry, is this issue of waste. And we a lot of times we tend to approach it as, there's an issue of waste and there's an issue of healthy materials. And we're not really drawing the connections there a lot of times. But really, if you think of, if you take that systems thinking approach with regenerative design, then we see that there is a connection between healthy materials in buildings and reducing waste and really creating a system where every output is going to be an input into another system. And it is very much possible to design this way. That's where the concept of circular economy and circular design as well comes from. And I really like what what Bill mentioned in his presentation, and it's another connection that I've been seeing more and more of recently, and I've been connecting those dots even in our practice as ZGF as well, is this connection between also healthy materials that don't have as many chemicals and embodied carbon and the lower CO2 emissions. So there's really a trend, and I think it would be great if we can think of this in a circular way, not just healthy materials in terms of the end occupant health, which we have made some great progress on, but really understanding that when we are specifying healthy materials, we're essentially specifying materials that have less toxic chemicals, that are more capable of being reused and recycled at the end of their life, because a lot of these chemicals, you don't want to recycle toxic chemicals into a new product. That is a big issue that we face right now with existing building materials and existing buildings. How do we reuse materials that have high toxic content? We really don't have a way to address that right now. So thinking of it in the sense of healthy materials will reduce our waste, and will also reduce our carbon emissions. And that's really when we get to a regenerative place in design where we can have, where materials and the built environment can have a positive handprint along the supply chain. And I borrow that term, by the way, from the International Living Future Institute, and they coined this term of handprinting, which I really like, because it's a positive way. Instead of thinking of our negative footprint, we can think of our positive handprints. How can we create positive handprints in the built environment? So I guess I will leave it with 2 points. One is that I do believe that we need to be able to measure the reusability of materials as we reduce toxic content. How much does that increase reusability? And right now, we don't really have a scale to be able to gauge that as designers. And 2, that we need to continue making these strong connections between healthy materials and embodied carbon and carbon emissions, because that's when we'll really make some big progress.
Thank you so much, Abida. And those two directions for our industry are absolutely spot on. How do we increase reusability and recycling, and how do we start to make more connections, as Bill did for us today, between climate change and health. The pandemic has taught us many things. One of them is the intimate connections between climate justice, environmental justice, and public health outcomes. This is not new. It has just been reinforced for us by our experience from the past year. So how do we use that energy and pump it into our work? A quick reminder to everyone in our audience today, we will be taking questions at any point during today's discussion. So if you have a question for our panelists, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A box. We're happy to tackle them. Also a reminder that after today's discussion, we will have a demonstration of Matter, which is a product management platform for both AEC professionals and building owners. Eileen, I'm going to come to you next. HDR is, of course, has made such huge strides in terms of, both sustainability and the use of healthy materials. But you're also a leader in the healthcare space, which is traditionally a very tough typology to create healthy buildings. And that sounds really ironic, but very often, healthcare buildings are held to such a high performance standard and are so tightly regulated. So can you reflect on your experience, within HDR, working on that typology and others as well, and just talk about what are some of those challenges, at the intersection of regulation as well as sustainability commitments for driving design with sustainability and wellness? How do we resolve some of those really wicked problems where, regulation and our intent to do good kind of are at loggerheads?
Yeah, thank you. Great question, Avi, and thank you so much for including me in this panel. as I reflected on your question when you sent it to me, of course, I think of the challenges in the healthcare building typology, as you mentioned, around what we have traditionally thought of as sustainability, a heavy emphasis on energy efficiency and energy reduction, which is difficult in healthcare because, especially in inpatient situations, the ventilation requirements, the air change requirement thresholds are so high that our architectural efforts in good efforts, important in proper massing and orientation, envelope performance, window performance, just don't have that big of a proportionate impact on the annual energy consumption of a building like a hospital. So certainly traditionally a challenging typology. As we begin to expand our definition of sustainability into more health and wellness, we have more opportunities. Challenges are just opportunities, right? To impact our early design with moves to enhance occupant health and wellness. Something that we are doing at HDR, and I want to springboard off of the energy thought and use what we're doing at HDR is using an energy modeling framework to build annual simulation tools for health and wellness metrics. That is, running simulations very similar to an energy model, but instead of looking at an EUI as the final output, we are looking at metrics that we are designing around, centering around the human experience. So things that you might think of as a health and wellness metric, like a daylight. Well, we're not going to use SDA, spatial daylight autonomy, because ultimately, fundamentally, that is an energy metric, right? We've borrowed that from sustainability and brought it into the health and wellness conversation, where maybe we need to rethink those metrics and make sure that they're centered on the human experience. We know SDA is an energy metric because it doesn't have a top end. Any, above the appropriate threshold for minimum lighting, there's no top end threshold. So something more appropriate might be a UDI that has a lower threshold and a higher threshold. Something else we're really considering is the perspective of the metric. So in a patient room, rather than evaluating the entire square footage of the room for view access, we really want to center that on the patient experience. What is the patient getting in terms of access to views to nature, right? From the literal position of the patient's head. Other metrics we might consider more still human-centered, right? The occupant experience, but they're moving. So in our healthcare design, our planners are awash with data about how nurses move through inpatient units. And we can piggyback off of that information and start to analyze, as those nurses move through inpatient units, how often are they encountering instances of biophilia or a vegetated element, right? How often are those nurses encountering views themselves, views to the exterior? What are the thermal ranges that a nurse experiences throughout their path in a normal shift? So we're really trying to shift the conversation from, focusing on percentage of square footage into something that's much more occupant centered, the human experience. And the last thing I want to say about the annual simulations as they relate to health and wellness is, we really need to develop some industry baselines around these conversations of health and wellness and the human experience. Right now, what we are doing is iteratively comparing different designs to each other to understand, this unit layout is better than this unit layout by this much in this particular metric. And that lacks a little bit of context, and we're forging some new ground here. But we will need to establish as an industry, what are those baselines that we consider, minimally acceptable for the health and wellness metrics that we design.
Thank you so much, Eileen. First of all, that sounds like such exciting work. Really doing those reviews, taking metrics that come from energy performance and energy modeling and kind of really examining them from a health and wellness lens. That is absolutely fantastic. And it's amazing that you see the healthcare space as an opportunity to do that. And you've added to Aviday's list of things that we need to develop in the industry. We need to understand recyclability. We also need to understand some baselines for human experience. There's some good movement around there, of course. The Well Building Institute and Fitwell and some of the other certifications in our industry have done some great work in kind of at least helping articulate the frameworks for those baselines. It's fantastic to see firms like HDR forge new paths, as you're saying, in terms of trying to understand, what is the minimum amount of daylight intensity that a space should have based on its programming, right? What is the minimum and maximum exposure to certain materials and elements? So thank you so much, Eileen. I'd love to bring MECO in here. Rachel, tell us a little bit about MECO's offerings, that support health and well-being, and what you're doing to support the efforts of designers and architects and analysts like Eileen and Aviday in terms of creating healthy buildings.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and including me in this discussion. I'm really appreciative of the time. And, you've really set me up well, because essentially what we're trying to do is create products and systems that help these goals really come to fruition. So for those who aren't familiar with MECO, we are manufacturers of manual, motorized, and automated shade systems. So when we look at our impacts, it's typically around daylight and materials and how they each impact people and the planet. And as people have mentioned, the perspective of what sustainability is or means to us has really changed over the last few years. Similar to Eileen, with our automated shading systems, when we traditionally looked at the sustainability of automation, right, which is the whole idea that shades raise to allow more daylight in, reduce that artificial lighting loads, was to really focus on energy efficiency. But that conversation is constantly changing and shifting for that human health. And so we're trying to, of course, update our systems and our automation to ensure that we're not just looking at energy, but looking at, the human health impact of daylight. So rather than having that energy metric or energy goal, we're trying to ensure that our systems are meeting your circadian systems or circadian strategy goals. So, we're right there with you. And as shades are pervasive, right? They're in every type of building typology, every type of vertical, whether that be, healthcare, education, commercial spaces. And as a result, each of the goals in those different spaces, when it comes to daylight, it really changes and transitions with the amount of daylight people are comfortable with. Is it a transitory space? Is it sedentary? How much daylight can people handle? So we're really looking at all of those aspects because you want to make sure people have accessibility and exposure to natural daylight, but comfort, of course, is key and most important, right? So how do we balance that? And that's really our goals when it comes to both our systems and our shade cloths. And so we're always trying to innovate and develop and keep pushing the envelope, the building envelope, right? As much as we possibly can, because in actuality, shades window shades activate the facade, right? And so, if they're down all the time, you're not getting those views, you're not getting those natural daylight. If you don't have them, it's a hostile building, you're experiencing discomfort. So it's really creating and setting up that balance. Now, one great example is we recently did a case study in the last couple of years with Terrapin, Bright Green, and Craig Galden Davis Architects on a school in Baltimore. And what it looked at was biophilic interventions on student learnings and outcomes. And I like to use this example. Window shades were not the only biophilic intervention. We were one of many. And it looked at the impact of student learnings and also student stress levels. And what from our side of things, they utilized a daylight sensor in the classroom. So the shade goes up, as often as it can and only comes down when glare is a risk factor. And we also actually printed on the shades itself. So we printed a fractal pattern that mimicked shade tree branches. So it looked like we were getting almost like a tree canopy, right? And so, when you looked at all of these different biophilic interventions, you saw a great impact on both improved learning outcomes and also reduced student stress levels. So again, as Eileen talked about in healthcare, there's different goals in the healthcare, right? You're looking at patient recovery rates, the amount of pain medication, you're looking at nursing. So each of these different verticals have different goals when it comes to daylight. Now, when it comes to materials, we have a whole different set of initiatives that we're really working on, which, go in tandem, but they have a different outline, right? So when we first started with our material health journey, it was really all about, it started in the late 90s, early 2000s with cradle to cradle certification. We used that as our design methodology. And the idea was to create a PVC-free shade cloth. And we did that. It released in early 2000s. It's called EcoVale. It's still the only cradle-to-cradle certified shade cloth with opaque yarns that mimics a vinyl-coated polyester textile, right? Bill talked about the importance of, taking away and eliminating PVC as much as possible. And so that was, our first kind of foray into that material health side, right? But now we've, looking at the different chemicals that are used in shade cloths, another big group that, is, again, pervasive in window shades are chemical flame retardants. Window shades have to pass and comply with NFPA 701. And we realized that, how could we optimize this out? And so a couple of years ago, we released a product called EcoVale Sheer, which was the first commercially available shade cloth that could pass NFPA 701 without any added chemical flame retardants. And I saw some questions about how can you be sure that people are telling the truth? Well, we had that same question. We had clients asking us to literally test our product to prove that we didn't have it. And so my only comment there is communicate with the manufacturer. If you have questions about what's in a product, talk to them about it. We're an open book. We're really trying to foster that communication. If you need us to do a test, we'll do a test. And so, we've started looking at multiple aspects of our chemicals that are used in shade cloths. And, we're consistently, trying to optimize our materials to reduce that chemical dependency. And then, the last bit, in today, looking at materials and health and well-being, as we're going back to the office, right? So we want to make sure our products are cleanable, that they can be disinfected, right? That's really important as we're going back to a healthy workplace. And then, we can talk about this another time, but circularity, right? Avida, we just completed our cradle to cradle version for certification. We submitted it at least for our motorized shade systems. And, a big part of that is standardizing circularity. How do we do that? How do we create systems for circularity that foster communication between the value chain so that we can get more communication and we can return products? Or if take back systems aren't feasible, how do we disassemble on site? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we can discover.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's really interesting that how your journey in terms of how you deal with the impacts of your product has really sort of mirrored that of the industry at large, moving from thinking about energy performance to thinking about health and well-being, but also thinking about material health and toxicity, and how those three things are connected. And I asked Eileen about regulation, and of course, for on the material sector, fire retardants are one of those intersection points where regulation is often at loggerheads with what is actually good for human beings. So thank you so much, Rachel, for bringing that up as well. Sue, I'd love to bring you in here. You are at Armstrong Ceilings. You're currently engaged with this initiative called the Living Lab, where you are, again, looking at developing resources or new perspectives on healthier building products, ceilings in your case. Tell us a little bit about that and how ceilings and ceiling retrofits can actually be a tool in creating healthier spaces.
Sure, Avi. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be part of this panel and this group. I'm so excited by the conversation so far and by our keynote speaker, Bill Walsh, Eileen, Avide, Rachel. I've got so many ideas and things I want to collaborate and talk about with you. So I'm excited to be part of this group and talking with all of you out there who've joined us. Here at Armstrong Ceilings, we're just so excited about the opportunity to keep innovating. When we have challenges like what we were confronting with over the last year and a half, we have an opportunity to kind of progress further on our sustainability journey, on our healthy building journey. And, we've enjoyed the opportunity to progress and learn along with the industry and to develop new solutions with our ceiling and wall solutions area. But we're really excited now. We took this time to take a little bit of a pause and say, how can we innovate even further with the role that ceiling and wall solutions can play? So during this time when we didn't have many people on our corporate campus, we innovated and created something we're calling the Living Lab. It's an office space that we've retrofitted to take a look at new solutions, technologies, human-centric design for our own teams to return to so we can make sure we're having the healthiest, safest place for our own people to come back and be at work. So it's a part of our corporate campus here in Pennsylvania, and it's really a dedicated innovation and pilot space where we're looking to test out new metrics, Eileen, and new ways of looking at human-centric design in an office sector, and deploying some new technologies and some new innovations and products that have a really strong fit in healthcare, as an example. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. We're really looking to integrate elements of more holistically healthy overall interior design with a focus on indoor environmental quality, and really taking ceiling and wall solutions in some places they haven't been before. We're kind of going off of a strong foundation in terms of what the role that it plays in acoustics and clean, sustainable materials. We've been on that journey with the industry to make sure that we have red list chemical-free products, transparent product declarations, EPDs, HPDs, natural types of materials, strongest industry-leading recycling program. But as we look at other elements and we look at the importance of daylight, we look at the importance of indoor air quality and how do we go beyond not off-gassing and not emitting? How do we really look at actively participating in some of the ventilation and design strategies, not just with the energy focused, as Eileen said, but with the focus on human health and wellness, that reassurance that you have constantly cleaned air and that type of element within the indoor air quality. So we put that all together in terms of our Living Lab, and we partnered with Gensler and some other leading players in creating this Living Lab space. It's a 10,000 square foot space that we retrofitted to make sure we could learn and test new ceiling and wall products. And it's now open and a place for different employee groups that are coming back to the office to give us feedback on new technologies and products and innovations that we've put in place there. We're putting in new design features that really go beyond what you would typically think of ceilings for, acoustics, as well as integration with lighting and good lighting and high light reflectance, to think about daylight, to thinking about bringing the outdoors in, biophilic design, indoor air quality in an active way, and thermal comfort in new ways. Part of it is we're testing sensors and a dashboard that help people know what's going on in the space around them, things they can't see that impact their performance and how they feel, with carbon dioxide levels, occupant density, real-time dashboards. And we've brought in some new innovations in the area of the way the air is moving in the space and the way that the ceiling plane, we're learning together with leaders in our industry, interplays with ventilation, and quality systems, and really how sealing up the ceiling plane. I think, Eileen, you mentioned like the building envelope and the window envelope and everything you have to care about in a healthcare environment. All of those things, the ceiling plane is, we're finding, is just as critical, not just for energy and making the ventilation systems work right, but how we can block certain types of contaminants, look at particulates, help the ventilation and filtration that ASHRAE and others are really talking about that are important from human health and wellness, not just from energy savings. So we're doing some things in some new ways there with new products that we've launched in the last year called our Air Assure ceiling tiles that help assure contain and clean the air by partnering with those air filtration systems. And also with an active air cleaning technology integrated into the ceiling plane with UVC light. UVC light safely done up in the plenum, but integrated into a ceiling format. And our VitaShield UVC panels, they actively clean the air and help with those active air exchanges that are helpful for office, healthcare, retail, hospitality, wherever people are gathered, so they can feel comfortable that they know that we're actively cleaning the air all the time. So we're excited about what this means for what we can learn for ourselves and our employees. We're using it to learn as we develop other buildings on our campus, and as we partner with folks like ZGF and HDR and other industry players. But how do we build better interiors? How do we learn together the way all these things come together? It's not enough to be focused on clean, sustainable materials, the transparency, recycling, doing all of those things well. How does it come together with all of us and other manufacturers, and how can we lead together and learn? So I would be excited to learn more about how we can be involved in some of the new metrics Eileen was talking about. And I wanted to build back to something someone else said about the importance of adaptive redesign and regenerative design. Because as we think about existing spaces, it won't be enough to come up with these new design paradigms for completely new construction and new building design. We have to figure out how we look at the existing building stock and how we can transform those spaces to be healthier spaces that people are living and working and playing and learning and healing in today. How do we attack those existing buildings and have retrofit ready types of solutions that take common building materials and systems, partner together, make it easy with the right metrics so you all can specify with confidence, so it can be installed with confidence, and get that combined result that we're really all after within the industry to move the next step forward. It's an exciting journey in part to be on, and we're just excited to be playing our part, and we'd invite people to learn more about what we're doing here and how we can partner with you on some of our innovations.
Thank you so much, Susan. First of all, I think it's really incredible that, you know, every major product category, every major building product division, you know, we hope that, you know, they start to examine all the ways in which that they're implicated, not just through, you know, material, chemical composition concerns, but rather how they can actively make a difference in the lived experience of a space. And I think that's a common thread between both what you said and Rachel said, but also connecting back to what Eileen and Avide said, you know, is how can we examine, how can we first, as Avide reminded us, take that systems approach, look at the broad systems for building, understand that we're setting in place sort of the wisest kind of you know, selection frameworks, the wisest sort of decision-making frameworks when it comes to, you know, regenerative and adaptable spaces, and then to narrow down into individual metrics, as Eileen was talking about, and then figuring out how we can improve or sort of achieve our targets on those metrics using products in ways that are not just to reduce the harm that those products might create, to kind of nullify their you know, their materiality, so to speak, but also to positively impact that handprinting idea that Avide spoke about. You know, how can we positively impact the experience of people in the space? And I think that's really exciting to see. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more in just a minute. A reminder to everyone in the audience, we're ready for questions from you. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A. I see that our panelists have been responding to some very particular or fact-based questions in there. But if you have any other queries or comments or reactions or suggestions for our panelists, please put them into the Q&A box and we'll start taking them in a few minutes. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Armstrong Ceilings and Wall Solutions, Carnegie, Dell Technologies, Formica, Meco, and Target. Thank you all so much for making today's discussion possible. A quick reminder, of course, that today's discussion will be followed by a demonstration of Matter, which is a materials management platform for both AEC professionals and owners, and has some amazing integration capacities to very important sustainability and health and wellness databases as well. So we'll take a look at that at the end of today's discussion. And also a quick reminder that our Planet Positive Awards deadline has been extended to June 30th. So if you are a firm engaged in projects that seek to make a positive impact in the world, whether that's through sustainability, whether it's through health and wellness, whether it's through community and equity, please check out our awards program. The link is in chat, and I strongly encourage you to enter. Our intention is to recognize broadly the good work that our industry has been doing and continues to do, and we'd love to recognize your work as part of that effort. So please go ahead and bring your entries in. I have a question for our panel here, and it's building off of the sort of path that Sue opened up for us. We know that while we desperately have to bring down the carbon footprint and the negative impacts of new construction, we can't continue to foster unhealthy or unsustainable building practices in new buildings. We do have a big challenge ahead of us in terms of retrofits and adaptive reuse. Particularly for interior designers, renovation is the lifeblood of our industry. It's one of the reasons why when Bill looks at total energy demand versus direct carbon dioxide emissions in his graph, we see that chemicals, petrochemicals suddenly have this huge impact beyond iron and steel and cement. And that's because interiors are renovated in the healthcare space every 5 years or so, in some workplaces every 3 years or so now. So we have this constant churn of interiors. And so, strategies for retrofit, adaptive reuse, and renovation are all kind of linked together. And I was wondering if anybody on the panel wants to start us off, and I'd love to hear from all of you in terms of how you're thinking about adaptive reuse, renovation, retrofits in your work. Just reflect on that generally within the framework of course, healthy buildings.
I'd be happy to kick this one off. So, adaptive reuse is something really, important for us because our building products have very long life cycles. So our products can be in a building for 25, 30 years. So when we're designing our systems, we're not just designing for that first tenant. We're designing for the first tenant, the second tenant, the third tenant. And there's different strategies that we use, to accomplish this approach. When you look at the systems approach, right, it's ensuring that when you're building a shade system, if you want to change out a shade cloth, but you want to keep the hardware in there, you can easily do that, right? This is just the simplest way. We have a spline system. So you can just change the shade cloth if it doesn't meet your aesthetic or something of that nature, right? And then we also create accessories, right? So now what we say is you can design buildings with the intent that there will be multiple use types in that space, right? So there's two examples that I can think of for that. The first is we have a product called Electro Pocket, where it's a pocket system that you can put either a manual or you can also pre-wire for motorized shades. So if you have one tenant that wants a manual shade, you can put that in, or you can pre-wire it and you can easily just hook in a motorized shade for the next tenant. So what that does is it reduces the amount of debris, it reduces the amount of maintenance, it reduces, ripping out ceiling tiles, right? We're all connected here, right? And so that's one option. And so we like to say that we can make buildings automation ready. So what will happen is a developer can put it in an automation backbone, get it ready for automation, but the tenant can choose what type of systems they want. So that modularity and flexibility is really important. When it comes to automation, we have different options. We have scalability, right? So if you have a space that is not, let's say, fully automation wired and automation ready, we have simple solutions for just a conference room, right? Where you can just put a daylight sensor in, or you can do a room, or you can do an entire building. We have different systems that are flexible for that reason, thinking about it long term. You know, and then just, you know, looking at everything from a circular perspective, these principles of design for disassembly, designing for longevity, designing for maintenance. Those are just ingrained in how we design our system since we have such long life cycles. And I think that's also extremely relevant to ensuring that we're building for adaptive reuse at the same time. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I just want to build on that a little bit from the perspective of healthcare. There is a lot of renovation in healthcare as you know, new surgical techniques or equipment are developed. New imaging equipment needs to be changed out, things like that. But going back to the regulations, Avi, that the threshold is very high for products that come into a space in terms of performance and certifications, right? Warranties, all those things. But I wonder in another building typology, if a more developed secondary market is reasonable for product reuse, right? We do have some small, maybe probably local instances of that. I can think of a couple here in Atlanta that really specialize in a secondary market, but I wonder if that can be more expansive industry-wide. Maybe not in healthcare quite so quickly, but maybe more open, you know, kinds of or flexible kinds of building typologies like commercial interiors.
I'll just say, you know, there's been some movement on that. There's a effort from you know, building products ecosystems to recycle and reuse, to close the loop on wallboard, gypsum wallboard. You know, there is an effort to create a market for refurbished or second use furniture through various dealers across the country. I hear Seattle and some other places have some really great product and material depositories that are doing that. You know, it's a patchwork of efforts, but I mean, you're absolutely right. I think, you know, there's some sectors where it's possible, you know, to it's tougher to bring in, you know, reused or refurbished materials, but some sectors where it isn't. And, you know, we have to think across sectors when we think about reuse. So we can't think about, you know, healthcare products going back into healthcare spaces necessarily. They should go into whatever spaces will accept them and wherever they can still perform and be functional and useful and beautiful. And so, you know, that's an interesting, I think, question. And I think it's a place where industry needs more work. Avida, you were going to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to plug in to this discussion about, you know, really circular design, especially when it comes to corporate office interiors. We're finding that it's more and more important these days as we're designing to think of longevity and reusability, flexibility. And I really think, you know, it needs to go beyond just saying that we have cubicles that we could swap out for different types of cubicles, right? It needs to be, how do we swap out? How do we effectively recycle or reuse partition walls? How do we actually move these things around and create the least amount of waste possible? I know some tech companies currently are looking into these strategies for their office spaces, and they're really looking into the future of circular design. And creating that secondary market. I think that, Eileen, you hit the nail on the head there, is for there to be a secondary market, there needs to be policies that make it easy for us as designers and incentivize the owners to reuse materials. And currently, those policies don't exist currently. There's some attempts at it in Los Angeles that I see, but it's it's if you for example recover certain demolition waste, you get some incentives in Los Angeles, but it's not quite enough for you to go down to the level of thinking, okay, I'll reuse this carpet or I'll reuse this drywall. And then again, going back to what I said earlier, is do you really want to reuse that carpet? I think that's our challenge right now, is we don't know what is in our buildings. So another thought I'd like to float out there, and this is just in terms of where I think we should be going, is really taking stock of the materials in our existing buildings and understanding what's in them. How can we start sort of creating that material bank of the materials that go into each building so that we know the exact makeup of that building? When we go into it, we know exactly where those products came from, which manufacturer they need to go back to, how to recycle it. So that's something that will take data, right? It's a matter of having that data and really starting to track that data as well, which I think we're actually starting to do that. Running, for example, life cycle analysis studies on our interior retrofit projects automatically requires us to take stock of the materials already there. It's a different level of information than what we would need for healthy materials and recycling materials, but we are starting to look at this whole building systems approach of the components inside a building. So we're making progress there, I think, but still a lot of ground to cover to become fully circular.
Yeah, and sorry to just jump in very quickly again. I see this question: can we also design with less materials? Great question. Yes. One of the challenges, the pushes and pulls of materials reuse and thinking about flexibility, design for replanning, moving spaces around very quickly and easily, deconstructibility, is we don't want to sacrifice that the health and wellness aspects that we are working so hard for now. I'm specifically thinking of acoustics, right? We don't want to sacrifice those absorptive materials, in favor of deconstructibility. So we have to think about ways that those fibrous and absorptive materials can be reused, even though those maybe are the more challenging materials to do that with.
Eileen, I was gonna jump in on that, because we've been hearing a lot about flexibility and exactly that, a point around acoustics. As people look to kind of future-proof a space, that'd be the best way to get longevity of the space. If you want that flexibility and you want to repurpose areas, you need to build in thinking about not just the thermal comfort or whatever, it's that acoustic comfort. And so you need certain types of materials in all surfaces, but inclusive of ceilings and walls. And one of the best ways in terms of reuse may be to look at making sure you can, if something's older, to your point, Avide, and you don't know what's in there, in terms of that life cycle analysis, but that if, can you take it back, recycle it, turn it into a new material that you know what the contents are, that it's a healthy, clean material, its footprint or its positive handprint, like our Tectum panels that are actually living future certified and part of kind of making a positive difference. It's balancing all these things. And I admire what you all do, because on the specification side, you have so much information flowing in to try to make all those choices, to try to create that best environment that's like you fit for the future, that's flexible for the space, but materials are an important part, reducing them to what's necessary, but it has to have the right feel, the right performance, and how it comes together. We're on that journey with you, and we've made a lot of progress. We know we have ways to go, but our goal is making it simple. So if anybody on this call, I know HDR and ZGF are probably really familiar with what we have, but if anybody on this call needs help around the ceiling and wall side, industry-wide, we can help you with those parameters and metrics and make sure you're getting what you need to think about that component, because acoustics does matter. At the end of the day, particularly for health and wellness, people need to be in a lively space in some places, but they need to be in calm, inspiring, quiet spaces to do any kinds of work and healing as well, and learning.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you for that offer. Again, all of you have led me directly to my next question here. That acoustics that we've brought up now, and really you could substitute any major health metric in here, for that acoustics piece. But an interesting example, at the end of the last year, we published in Metropolis some research from LMN Architects in the Carbon Leadership Forum around the carbon footprint of tenant improvement projects, interior renovation projects. And Avide, I know ZGF is working on that as well. And one of the sort of biggest sort of carbon offenders, so to speak, so biggest carbon footprint for biggest volume are partition walls and acoustic panels. And yet both of those things are absolutely essential for any kind of, human habitable space now, right? Especially within the existing buildings that we've built, maybe if we were to think of new construction where, it's all not glass and steel, and we find some revolutionary new construction technology, hello mass timber. But with the buildings that we have now, we cannot do away without some kind of acoustic surfacing, some kind of wall panels, and then of course, Rachel, some kind of daylight modulation, control, lighting sort of mechanism, right? So, and yet all of those are carbon intensive, and they have potential for toxicity, right? So how do we make those trade-offs? So I'd love to hear from all of you in your own work. How are you setting priorities? How are you finding hotspots, for you to act? Because, out of the hundreds of materials in a building and the, let's admit it, scores or hundreds of materials in product assemblies, how do you decide where you can make the most difference? And how do you work on some of those trade-offs, right? How do you decide that something is absolutely essential for the human experience of the space? And so maybe we need to find our carbon savings elsewhere. Maybe we need some other mitigation strategies. Maybe we need something else. So how are you currently taking those decisions?
Well, I can, start off just by saying that finding products that are multi-purpose are really important, that can play multiple roles in a space. So something with acoustics becoming more and more trackable and people needing calculations. So we've been testing all of our shade cloths for acoustic properties also. And so we have NRCs up to 0.6 actually for some of them. So, people are using shade cloths as partitions. They're using them in conference rooms, not just for daylighting tools, but also for sound absorption, for privacy. So you can use it for multiple facets, and they're also modular, so they can go up, they can go down. So you can use our product in multiple ways. I think that's really, just honing in on that acoustics portion is something that's interesting. But for us, just in terms of how we prioritize what's important, the number one thing we always talk about is occupancy comfort, because if the people aren't comfortable, and whatever comfort that may mean, there's many different types of comfort, right? It's a smell from off gassing, it's glare, it's too much noise, whatever that may be. If the building isn't functioning properly, people will not want to be in the building itself. So that for us is how I would say, prioritize what's important. When we're balancing all these different attributes of what a health and wellness means to just the industry in general. And we always want to ensure that, people first in terms of just what we're thinking about, but without disregarding everything else, of course. But we always just want to make sure that people are comfortable and happy. And we don't want them to know that we're doing things, right? That's the whole idea.
So I'll jump in here and mention that it is a challenge, especially with the amount of information that we have as designers when we're selecting materials. Which piece of information do we prioritize, right? Is it planet health? Is it human health? Is it carbon emissions? Is it some other, aesthetic criteria, acoustic criteria, some other performance criteria? And it is quite a bit overwhelming. I think that's been the challenge, is deciphering all of this information in a way that enables us to make the right decisions on each of our projects. And I would say that it's really a case-by-case scenario. At ZGF, we're actually in the process of creating an internal guidebook, a materials playbook that we call, to guide designers through choosing the right types of materials and prioritizing the right things. I think what Bill referred to with the red to green list of materials, and it's just categories of materials, not specific products, but categories of materials. That's a very helpful way of looking at it. And we're really trying to develop a guideline like that so that we can have a quick hand tool to, okay, which product is going to meet my aesthetic requirements, my performance requirements, but also be healthier, but also be lower carbon footprint. And I would say that's continuously developing. We're just getting so much information continuously every day to this. That's another challenge, is keeping things up to date. Another thing is that at the same time, there are a lot of synergies between health, carbon, waste. And whenever we can hit those three all together at the same time, that's really a win-win-win scenario for us and for our clients. So whenever we can use materials that have less toxicity, less chemical content, but also probably have lower carbon emissions, then those are the materials that we will go with. And a lot of times it's not necessarily that it's going to cost the client more or cause more headaches for us on the design side. It's just a conscious decision and knowing when to make those decisions. So continuously working on that, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think the answer is yes, everything all at once together. We need to be working on, and it can be overwhelming. We have at HDR, we have sort of a broad swath of sustainability expertise, but also pockets of very deep and focused expertise in material health or carbon reduction or social equity, or what, all these different topics, whatever it is, and we need to be hitting them all. And similar to ZGF, I think our master specs are constantly being upgraded, reviewed and upgraded, and we're trying to lift all boats to the extent that we can, universally. Once a product or product family is basically universally available, then we incorporate it into our master specs, and little by little we're raising all boats. And then there are those individual projects that are individual clients that are extremely passionate about one or two areas, like social equity or carbon reduction, for example. And another might be just very passionate about material health. And there we'll really push the envelope. But we still have that sort of baseline performance resting on our master specs that hopefully across the board we've incorporated as much as we can universally available.
Yeah, I think absolutely, creating some kind of internal resource like that and then maintaining it is really, really important, and something that I think all firms all practices, no matter the size of the firm, need to put some resources towards. And, resources like Home Free, which I mentioned earlier, are really useful in terms of guidelines. If you're looking for carbon information, the Carbon Leadership Forum, at least for major building materials, not for all interior materials, has released baselines and updates them every year. So 2021 baselines are available now. So there is support and help out there with expertise for anyone listening who wants to kind of, start on this journey. I have a question here from Florence Chan. I think Avida and Eileen may be most appropriate for both of you, but I know that, Armstrong has been involved with the back end of this pledge as well. So if you have any insights, Sue, that would be great. Florence Chan asks, how do you align your project material health concerns and goals with the AIA Materials Pledge protocol, especially with social health and equity? So Florence is referring to the AIA A&D Materials Pledge, which if you haven't checked out, I strongly urge you to go and check out. It's just a Google search away, AIA A&D Materials Pledge. It's a new pledge developed, I think released just last year around goals for material specification and product selection. Eileen and Avide, are you, if you are looking at the A&D Materials Pledge protocol, which I know both of your firms have been involved in developing, how are you doing that? And if not, if that's not, currently a driver within individual projects, I understand that even though it might be a firm-wide sort of goal, how are you looking at social health and equity through as part of your work on material health, on healthy buildings? How do you think about that equity piece? Avide, you mentioned this in your early comments. Eileen, you talked about it as well. If we can just circle back to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I can start off speaking to that. So the social health and equity part is a difficult one to wrap our heads around because the impacts go throughout. You have to trace it back to the supply chain. We're not just looking at the end user impacts. And what we've discovered is most effective is really to educate all of our staff, all of our designers on the impacts of individual material choices and social equity, social impact. So the way we're doing that is we've actually launched an education series, it's internal about materials, and it's the intersection. It's really exploring the intersection of materials and social equity. Within the past year, I think there's been a lot of talk about social equity, social justice with the Black Lives Movement, especially. And this is just another step at looking at how our work is impacting communities out there, how the materials that we're choosing are impacting communities out there, even though it may not be immediate to us or incredibly tangible to us as we're sitting in the office selecting these materials, that there are impacts that go beyond the realm of our office or our city, depending on where the product is coming from. So we took a cue from really the embodied carbon approach and what Architecture 2030 had set in terms of identifying high impact materials. They identified high impact materials for embodied carbon. We're going through a similar thing where we're identifying high impact materials in terms of social equity and material health. What are those top categories that we should absolutely try to replace? One of those for us on the top of our list is vinyl, is the use of vinyl and PVC in projects. It's really helping designers understand that, vinyl is produced through chlorine gas. Chlorine gas production is still the #1 and the only remaining use of asbestos in the country. Is huge. Most designers, most people out there think that asbestos has been banned already. We don't need to think about it anymore. It is still being used, and it's going directly into materials that we are producing in the United States, 70% of which is going towards the building industry specifically. And again, nodding back to Bill Walsh and the Healthy Building Network's research, which we rely on heavily to pull this data from, it's really just connecting the dots. So long-winded answer to your question is that we're really trying to achieve this through education, because as soon as somebody identifies, oh, this is the impact that I can have on communities, okay, I can start to look at not using luxury vinyl tile. Let's look at a different type of flooring. Let's not use PVC roofing. Let's look at a different type of roofing. And it comes down to simple choices like that. That's digestible, that's clear. And we're really trying to keep it high level right now, and then doing a deeper dive as we discover more information on supply chain and social equity to make more nuanced decisions.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that, I think we're doing similarly, we're doing a lot of learning and education right now around the social impacts of our material choices, both internally and also with our clients and with our vendors. So there's industry-wide a level of education that we're all, trying to wrap our heads around. Also, high impact materials, agree. Things like chrome, very inert in a space and non-toxic to an occupant, but the production and the chrome plating process is incredibly harmful to the workers. So we're asking a lot of questions around that. Anytime we're pitched a new material, we are asking questions about manufacturing processes, how they manage their waste streams, their waste flows, effluent, things like that. So it's a big conversation, and I think being more transparent about the topic and continuing to learn, I think is where we're at now.
I jump in briefly. I think just speaking from a manufacturer's perspective, that AIA pledge really does go out to the design firms, but we're willing and ready to assist with the information you need to be transparent when you're looking at choices and specification, get you the information you need about how products are made, what materials are composed of. And we have commitments as a company. We'll be publishing our first sustainability report this July with a number of goals about where we're directed towards 2030, about not just products, which has been our central core and building on a foundation of our journey, but also people and planet. So when we think about social, equity and justice, just really across the board, how we're looking at that to be a responsible player within the industry, products and beyond. So we stand ready to assist around that pledge as firms, as you all and those of you listening are looking for information to be able to specify with confidence and the transparency of the information you need.
So I mentioned this earlier, but we just submitted, haven't got it back yet, but the cradle version 4 beta standard, and they have really expanded that social requirement. And it's looking at your supply chain, it's looking at your communities, it's looking at your, all different aspects of how your product is made. It's doing social hotspots. And so I think this is starting to get, built out more and more. And, I don't have all the answers for this, as a lot of people mentioned as well. we're still figuring out how to, properly tackle this. But I do think that having some sort of standards and procedures from a manufacturer's perspective that I can go to my senior level, to my director of supply chain, to my director of HR, to me really connect those dots. That's kind of been the value for me of going through this V4 cradle to cradle process. So I just, it's still in its infancy. It was just released, but I definitely think, cradle to cradle is more than a material health tool. There is a huge social component to it that I think, I'm really interested to see how it aligns with the AIA pledge as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. A quick question here. And Avide, maybe you should take this one. Lois asked, would we want to ask that manufacturers disclose information on energy and possible emissions in the recycling process? So while we're looking at recyclability, we have to understand that recycling also has carbon emissions associated with it. How are you thinking about that, Avide?
That is a great point. Yeah, I think part of that, if you're looking at, for example, EPDs and life cycle analysis, there is a stage in the life cycle analysis for recycling that actually does measure the impacts of energy intensity and carbon emissions from the recycling and end of life process. So there are some EPDs that will cover that stage and that range. I think that's the most accurate data I have seen on that end so far. I would certainly love to see more of that. I think at this point we're just getting the data on this and wrapping our heads around it.
Yeah. So Before we proceed, I don't usually do this, but I'd love to get on my soapbox for a second, if everyone will be patient with me, and say, that there's many ways that architects and designers and manufacturers, everybody in our industry, contractors, developers, everyone included, can make a huge difference to health outcomes. And we have seen the world turn to us for expertise during this global pandemic. There has been more coverage of indoor air quality, of indoor environmental quality, of of the impact that buildings can have in health this year than there has ever been, right? And so we're in this amazing moment where a lot of the decisions we take at a systems level, to bring us back to where Avide started us off, and at the conceptual level, at the analytical level, at the research level where Eileen was talking about, we have a huge impact we can make. But I just want to also talk, because we've spent so much time talking about it, the impact that we all can have at the product specification and product selection level, which the AIA Materials Pledge is really spot on in addressing, and that Bill spoke about in his address as well. Our research, through Metropolis's sister concern, FinClab, our research organization, says that, as architects and interior designers, especially in the commercial space, but also in the residential sector, might have 100 times or up to 400 times more purchasing power by volume and by dollars than individual consumers. So much as we try to make a difference as individuals in our own lives, the best place for us to direct our efforts, whether it's activism around climate change or climate justice, whether it's activism around social justice, is really through our professional sphere. It's through our professional ambit. We have way more power in our work as professionals than we do in our capacity as individuals. And that's especially true when it comes to social equity. We're used to thinking about social equity in political terms, and that is really important. Do what you need to do to support the communities you have to support. But at the same time, remember that you can also support them through the professional choices that you make. And that is something that we're really starting to understand. So it's really, really important for us to keep digging into that aspect. And all the panelists here have echoed this idea, right? That there's a lot we can do. Thank you all so much for the amazing insights you've shared with us today. A quick thank you again to our sponsors, Armstrong Ceilings and Wall Solutions, Carnegie, Dell Technologies, Formica, Meco, and Tarkett for supporting today's discussion. A huge thank you to our panelists, Avide, Eileen, Rachel, and Sue, for all your insights today and for being so generous and thoughtful and really clear and pragmatic in your inputs today. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate everything that each of you does in your professional sphere. All of you play a huge role in making our society better, making our buildings healthier. And really, I thank you all for the effort and the time and the dedication and passion that you all put into it. I truly, truly appreciate it.